Our economy is producing economic progress, but the distribution of the income is going mostly ever upwards to an ever smaller number of people.
Yeah.
It's shoving the wages down below the cost of living for huge percentages of America, and they have to do various things to compensate. It is, instead of focusing on balancing and putting a floor under people's wages, we're not trying to hit the middle here. We're just trying to say if someone is willing to work a 40 or a regular full work week, he or she ought to be able to earn enough to, at least in a frugal way, live and be in control of their lives.
Hey y'all, welcome to the Texas Forward podcast. Today we have an awesome conversation with Rick Hubbard, who is walking to fix democracy. Rick is 82 years old and continues to work to reform our democracy. Rick is a longtime activist, author, and in his own words, Vermonter. He wants a future where American democracy represents the interest of all Americans. Rick and Brian discuss the three main reasons our democracy isn't working and what we can do to fix it. I hope this conversation will inspire you to continue the good fight. And remember, you're never too old to start, and it's never too late to work towards change. If you want more from the Texas Forward podcast, follow us on X, formerly Twitter, at FWD_Texas, and on Instagram at Texas_FWD. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, don't forget to like and subscribe.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Texas Forward podcast. I'm Brian Lee, and joining me this evening is Rick Hubbard. How you doing, Rick?
Hi, Brian. Nice to be here. Greetings from Vermont, all the way to Texas.
Yes, I've never been to Vermont. Are you native from Vermont?
I'm a native Vermonter, but I did skip out of the state for about 10 years, military for 2 or 3 overseas, but Europe. I'm pre-Vietnam. And then lots and lots of grad school, a business economics degree and a law degree. And I was probably 31 before I got out of school. Didn't have a penny in my pocket to speak of, but I didn't have any debt in the old days.
Well, that's...
And, compare that to today.
No kidding. I mean, I can't imagine there's many people listening to this who would not be envious of that situation you just described.
I know. And I thought it was hard when I started, and I don't believe that at all today. It's much harder for people today.
Absolutely.
Sadly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's, I think, a good place to start. I think, there's a lot of things wrong in America today. Obviously, that's in part why the Forward Party exists, is to, because the Democrat and Republican parties are failing the American people. They're falling short. They're not doing their jobs, in essence. And we talked about that a little bit the other day before the show. What exactly are the jobs of elected officials? And in your opinion, where do you think they're falling short?
Okay. Let's look at the Constitution, because when they're elected, at least on the federal level, they take an oath to follow and adhere to the U.S. Constitution and do their best to support it and implement. But it applies to representatives on the state level who focus on the wording of their state constitutions, but most of them define, in a rough sense, general sense, what it's about. So in the federal Constitution, if you go to the preamble, we've all read it in the past, but it talks about establishing justice, ensuring domestic tranquility, providing for the common defense, promoting the general welfare, and it goes on from there. Mm-hmm. And those are pretty broad focuses of what those representatives that we elect federally anyways, take an oath to implement when they follow the Constitution. And that would translate into looking at the issues that face all 330 million of us: healthcare, the economy, our political system, and examining and analyzing alternative ways, various system options, and then supporting and picking the option that is going to best serve at the most efficient economic, cost and way, all the greatest percentage of all 330 million. So in healthcare, for example, it would be logically to provide good quality healthcare to all Americans at the least total system-wide cost, regardless of whether we're talking public or private, whichever way the analysis flows, in a manner that is economically and socially sustainable. With the economy, we've clearly adopted capitalism, but it has advantages and it has disadvantages. Congress's job would be to balance those advantages and disadvantages so that capitalism works broadly for all of us and does not, as it has been doing and is doing, drive wages as low as they will go as long as someone will show up for work, and with housing and healthcare and other costs, put as much as 40 to 60% of everybody working in America in a position where they don't have a penny in the bank for emergencies. They are living paycheck to paycheck. And that is not a healthy way for our country. So it would be to balance that. And the last would be to set up a political system that's fair and equitable for all of us, not just for the Dems and the Republicans. And on all of those issues, most of us in America, regardless of our ideology, know we got big problems.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and I didn't catch if you said in there in the preamble if it said the what their job is to beat the Democrats or the Republicans in the upcoming election and get reelected at all costs. I'm pretty sure I didn't catch that. I might have missed it.
That's the way they translate it, I think.
Yeah,
it's taking a lot of liberty.
Yeah, it seems
but
that way.
You're right. That is where it's gone. And it's sad. They're spending much more time on staying in power and getting elected and pleasing all the pieces and people they have to do that than they are on doing what I said, which is their job. They take an oath to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's one of the most powerful examples of that. I think just generally, you could pick any issue you want. It's these politicians these days, they're not interested in solving our problems. They're interested in running on them. There's countless examples of that on both sides of the aisle where you can point to and say, this is something that could have been addressed, but it wasn't because this gets our base riled up. On the right, let's say immigration. On the left, you could point to abortion in a recent, event. These are things that they've had opportunities to pass meaningful legislation on and just have not done so for the political ammunition. So
that's right. And it's sad because those actions have effects, or inactions have effect. And it is basically these policies that they're not acting on, say, take the three that I just mentioned, there are more, have in combination led us to the situation we have in America. And most Americans are aware that things aren't working right. But if you go out and measure how well our political service system is serving citizens, there are 4 or 5 ways you might broadly frame that. And on almost actually on every one of those, we're going downhill. Our economy is producing economic progress, but the distribution of the income is going mostly ever upwards to an ever smaller number of people.
Yeah,
it's shoving the wages down below the cost of living for huge percentages of America, and they have to do various things to compensate. It is, instead of focusing on balancing and putting a floor under people's wages, we're not trying to hit the middle here. We're just trying to say if someone is willing to work a 40 or a regular full work week, they he or she ought to be able to earn enough to, at least in a frugal way, live and be in control of their lives.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's not asking much, right? It's essentially that's the American dream. That's what, at one point in time was the envy of the world when you think about the middle class, during the 50s and 60s post World War II. What, you know, that it's simply put, you should be able to work hard and within reason, even if you have to live somewhat frugally, live a good life where you're in control of it. That was beautifully said.
That's right. And sadly, uh, we not only have reached a point where large numbers of people are not, but it is producing the anxiety, the anger. It has side effects when people don't have enough money and can't take care of themselves. Healthcare problems develop. The anxiety leads to mental kind of issues, drinking, drugs, and the side effects and effects of that. It leads to lack of respect for our representatives and our governmental process because people know that politicians aren't doing their job. And there are a host of other side effects. And if you fix those, just those three things that I mentioned, uh, America would be a very different place. We'd be on our way to being a shining beacon for democracy or representative democracy in the world among countries.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to get into the solutions or some of those solutions potentially as to how we get back to that point. But I want to back up a little bit and talk about what's written there on your shirt. So, walking to fix democracy. For those of you who might not be watching the video here, um, tell us, Rick, about what walking to fix our democracy is and what made you want to do that.
First of all, it is a walk across the country from the West Coast, LA area, specifically the Rose Bowl as a start. And it is to go to Washington, D.C. The walking time will take plus or minus a year and 4 months. And it's to link up with activists in states and to publicize the things we're talking about and to basically lend my efforts to all those other organizations and people who know we've got a problem and are trying to fix it. But we still need more people involved. We need more people to stand up in all kinds of ways. And so it's
Sure.
to do all of that. And it comes about because, as you know, I'm an old guy. I'm 81 and a half. And I grew up in that 50s, 60s, 70s period where things were better. And on my watch, I have seen it get worse, and I have enough background to be able to understand some of the causes. I don't claim to be the expert.
Sure.
And I'm upset and bothered because I've been involved with organizations trying to fix it. Going way back, I was on Common Cause's National Governing Board for half a dozen years back in the early 80s. We were asking Congress to fix it. And so that has led me to say, what can you do at 80 plus when you see things going wrong, and how can you help? And that's what's behind it in the rough sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's another great way to frame that in particular is, what can I do to help? Right. It's, if more people felt that way and more people took action on that, I think that would go a long way, and hopefully more people begin to, and I think more people are starting to really ask that question.
Well, here's one back to you, Brian. When you have the studies show that 40 to 60% of everybody working today is working what they're working, and they don't have a penny in the bank. They have to be working hard enough just to stay, head barely above water. Uh, what kind of time do they have to get involved in actions like this? And that's 40 to 60% of all Americans. We've
Yeah.
almost made it impossible. They're in harness
That's such a great point.
economically.
That's such a great point. And I mean, yeah, how many Americans, if you're in that situation, what you're probably doing with your free time and is finding another job, finding another way to make, a little extra money and focusing on
You
saving
don't
what,
have time
you
for the
have,
other
right?
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so true. So true. So with walking to fix democracy, have you done any of the walking yet? I thought you did this earlier in the year, right?
Yes, unfortunately. Here's what happened. Uh, I started this venture, actually doing the venture, the 1st of October of last fall.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I had based it on the fact that my life partner, Sally, and I thought that I have to back up a step here. She, about 4 years ago from now, but 2.5 years or so, almost three, from the time I started the walk, she was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. She'd had issues for a long time with her breasts, and they'd done everything to look at them, biopsy them, and always said, nope, good to go. But
Yeah.
when it wasn't, and when she spotted the lymph node under her right arm, it had already gone beyond it. But it was being beautifully held in check by the first treatment.
Yeah.
And we were climbing mountains together last August. And that was just before we do that fairly regularly, normally did. And that was just before I began the walk. We figured I could do the walk and be back in that amount of time, a year and 4 months, before she might need me, if she needed me, because things were going so well. Unfortunately, it changed, and probably it began to be, symptoms came out in roughly the beginning of November. And it probably had gotten past the treatment back about the time I was leaving, but neither of us knew it. And it took a while for stuff to show up in a way
Yeah.
that she flagged and took to the doctor. Anyways, she had a big problem when they did all the new testing and second opinions. And it was very clear she was in deep trouble. And at that point, I had begun, the 1st of October, I had walked sort of in that big open desert stage. Go prove yourself, Rick, that you can do this. And I had walked, pushing toward 600 miles across the California desert, the Nevada desert, and a good chunk of the Arizona desert. And I'd gone down to Phoenix for an event, and she was going to come and join me 2 days later. And she called 2 days before she was to come and said, I'm in big trouble. And fast forward about 3 weeks till the testing got done, and the results came in, and it was clear she was in real trouble. So I needed to be there. And so I suspended the walk on 2 days' notice and found a place to store safely the RV. It's sitting outside securely at a place north of Phoenix, but in the city limits of Phoenix, about 20 miles away. And it's in that 110-degree day after day sun. And I'm worried tremendously about the wrapping of that RV that makes it all messaging
Yeah.
what the sun is doing to it. So now I have come back. I've taken care of her. I was her full-time caregiver until she was overwhelmed by the cancer in early April on the 8th. And then it took a couple of months to prepare and do a good job of celebrating her life with a big celebration. That happened about 4 weeks ago. And now I've done everything I can. It's time to refocus on a whole different life without Sally and what it means for me. So it's hard. It's a big chunk, but I'm now ready to go out and restart the walk and put one foot in front of the other, in addition to all the big reasons for going out.
Well, that's tough. Honestly, that's my condolences to you on that, Rick. And God bless you for picking back up. And I'm sure she's proud of you for getting back to what you believe in, fighting for what you believe in.
She believed in this. She knew the importance of this, and she understood why I was doing it. But we all have priorities in life.
Absolutely.
So the present plan is I'm very close to getting out of Vermont. I hope to leave in 2 or 3 days from now and drive the tow car for the RV, the small one on the back out to where the RV is, and then I will pick up the walk again.
Okay. So the walk, you're driving the RV. Is that just a part of? Are you driving the RV to specific locations, and then like how's the RV? Are you pulling it? Like how's this work?
It's it's complex, and this is an all volunteer operation.
Okay.
Right, even though the organization Declaration for American Democracy, which is the messaging service among 250 of the biggest organizations working on this problem in the country. They're not all big, but it's a mix. They are loosely trying to help, put the word out and do that sort of thing. Uh, and So when I was there before, I had more advanced time and I had volunteers lined up, not all the time, to drive the RV, and I had somebody helping with media, back home,
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. But when I didn't have a volunteer, and there were a few weeks when I didn't, here's how it works. It's easy with the volunteer. They drive the RV. They go down the road, maybe whatever we agree on. Let's say I'm trying to do 10 miles a day, 5 days a week, 50 miles a week to go across the country in a rough sense. So they'd go down to maybe 2 miles or whatever fits, and we'd have a break point. And they'd drop me at the beginning. I'd walk to that point. I'd take a short break, have something to drink, maybe put some more sunscreen on,
Yeah.
those kind of things. And then I'd get out and keep walking. They'd jump ahead and we'd repeat till the end of the 10 miles. If I don't have a volunteer driver and others supporting me, then I have to go drive the RV and the tow car 10 miles past where I left off. Or if I want to break it in half, 5 miles, and then I have to repeat for the second 5. I then unhook the tow car, drive it back 5 miles, and I walk from the tow car up to the RV. And then I drive the RV back, hook up the tow car, drive back the 5 miles, jump another 5 miles to the end of the day, and then repeat. So it's much less efficient. Takes an extra hour and a half probably, and it adds on to a 4 to 5 hour walking day typically. So there you have it.
Wow, that's very interesting.
There's a fallback, and there's something much better. And I can use volunteers. If anybody out there listening would like to sign up, there's a way to get in touch and help.
And how would we reach you if somebody's listening and would be interested in volunteering?
Through the website, which is there's a www dot in front of it, but fixourdemocracy.org. Run it all together.
Yeah,
www.fixourdemocracy.org.
Perfect. And we will link that in the notes to the episode as well. So,
okay. And there's a take action tab, and under that, volunteer and so forth.
But you're not going through Texas, it looks like, huh?
No. Granny D did, though.
Who's Granny D?
Are you familiar with her walk?
No, I'm not.
Oh, she puts me to shame. She's a New Hampshire nearby neighbor. I mean, it's a couple hours to where she grew up in New Hampshire. And she did a walk across the country it was narrowly focused on campaign finance reform.
Mm-hmm.
And it was back in 1998 to 2000. And it took her about the same amount of time that I'm talking about. She took a more southern route. She went through Austin, well, north of Austin, but she went through kind of that much more southern route, and then began to angle up through Missouri and then up through West Virginia and Ohio and then down to Washington, D.C. So that was then, and she broke through in the media. She got a fair amount of publicity.
Yeah.
And it did result in some legislation, the McCain-Feingold Act. Unfortunately, that's been pretty heavily dismantled, but it wasn't nearly broad enough to actually fix the problem. As you said, Congress loves to take a problem like healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
We're not actually going to fix it. like the objective I set out, provide good quality health care for all Americans at the lowest total wide system cost, help all 330 plus million of us. We're going to take a little incremental increase that we can blog about and run on and so forth, and we'll make progress on the issue in increments that don't really ever solve the issue.
Yeah.
And that is a result of the pressures you defined and summarized pretty well earlier.
Yeah, definitely. So, it's such a hard problem to solve. What political solutions? Let's talk about some of the solutions that you're advocating for with your walk. It's not just about getting attention, and it's one thing to say there's a problem, but it's quite another to actually set out and try to solve it with specific policy solutions. So, what are some of those solutions that you're really pushing for?
Okay. At the state level, things the states can control because they set the rules on how we run the political elections in their states. For example, they set up either open primaries or closed primaries, the way we have in many states. The Iowa caucus, I guess, is an aberrant from that.
Yeah.
But that kind of thing, when do we vote? What's the procedure to vote? They have a lot of control over that. So there are things the states can do, and I'll cover them in a minute. One is to change the primary process. And basically, I'll explain why in a minute, but change it completely. And instead of the Republican primary and the Democratic primary, there's no such thing as an independence primary.
Yeah.
If you're an independent in America today, and roughly 35 to 40% of all voter eligible people in America are independent. It's roughly a third, and a third between independents, Dems, and Republicans.
Yeah.
And the independents are the ones rising at the expense of the other two. So you don't have a candidate you can vote for unless you either vote in you're a registered Republican in a closed primary state or a Democrat. You get their ballot to vote. You don't vote. Or in Vermont, you have an open primary, so I can take a Republican or a Democratic, or we have a progressive party vote in Vermont too. But I still don't have independents available. And by the time you get through the primary, you're 60% of the way to the general election. What's fair about that? Nobody's heard about you.
Yeah.
And so think of how it would change if you put all those candidates from all the parties on a single open primary vote. And instead of just the Republicans voting in a closed primary, you allowed, and Democrats similarly and so forth, you allowed all registered voters to pick the 4 or 5 highest vote getters out of the primary to go on to the general election. And then you used ranked choice voting. So you didn't have a minority electing whomever we elected, but you had a majority of us behind whomever we elected. I can give you a good example on how that would tremendously change the process.
Yeah,
but
please do.
I want to add one more thing first.
Okay.
Which is that if we want to obtain proper representation, we can't just fix one thing, even though we may have to approach it a time, but only when we fix enough or all of the pieces of the problem are we going to change the result. And it's a complex system problem.
Mm-hmm.
Let me give you an example. Let's say Brian, you're now going to be the CEO of General Motors for a little while. And you as CEO have got a big problem. You have one of your cars aligns, I don't care which one we pick, let's pick on Chevys, coming across the assembly line and it's unsafe. It's failing the crash test.
Yeah.
So you ask your engineers, what's wrong? And they go and analyze it and they come back and say, Brian, it isn't just one thing. It could be many things or a combination of them. We could be using the wrong structural material. We could be designing the way we're using it with a flaw. It could be that the coding on our automated robots is screwed up and they're creating a problem. It could be that our workers are upset and they're part of the problem.
Sure.
And there are a few other options. So If you say, like Congress says, well, I'll fix this little piece, but only one of those several things that are interconnected, you're still, as a CEO, going to have unsafe cars rolling off the assembly line. And it's the same analogy with our federal government. So we'll talk about a few things that are within state control,
Yeah.
but there's much more we could be and should be if we want to really solve the problem.
Yeah. And that's such an interesting way to look at it too, because ultimately we don't know, what is going to work and what isn't until we try something, right? These are hypotheses on, and they've been studied by political scientists, and they have been tested in various, local and various forms of government. Um, but ultimately, you have to try different things if something's broken, and kind of look at the results objectively, right? And that's something
Mhm.
else too that I feel like our lawmakers just don't do. If they pass a bill, they don't go back and look at it, and at least in the public, display, have a public conversation about it and say, okay, did this work or not? We don't assess things as we should, as you would in a situation like that if you're, running a company and trying to understand what's wrong with the car, what is what we're doing working, right?
I think you're right.
Yeah. So ranked choice voting is another one that, and actually, before we get into that, I wanted to ask you, I wanted to be devil's advocate here on the single ballot primary. Um,
Mhm.
do you know how many states off the top of your head? And this was not the devil's advocate part. How many states do this now, or at least have an open primary now versus closed
Well,
primary?
the one most people might have heard about is Alaska, because they put an open primary with a single ballot, everybody's name on it. They picked the top four for the various positions to go into the general election, and then they used ranked choice voting. And it allows a majority of Alaskans, in this case, to pick whomever they are going to support as their representative. Most other systems promote whoever we pick with a minority of support. You can win with a minority, first past the post, a typical plurality voting system. So when you need a majority, you tend to have to spread your net and your policies wider so that a majority of people feel they're going to serve their interests. And right, nothing's perfect, but Alaska's the first one. Nevada is trying to do the same thing. They have to change their constitution. It takes two votes, separately, a year or so apart. They did the last one and they voted to do this. They're going to, like Alaska, but top five instead of top four people going on to the general election. And they're going to revote it this next November. And if they pass it a second time, it will be law. And California has a variance of some of those issues. Maine has a variance of some of those. Maybe you can fill in somebody else, but those are four that come to mind.
Yeah, I don't know of any others off the top of my head, but yeah. So the general idea being, if as of right now, the incentives are set up in a way to basically play to the only people who are voting in primaries, closed primaries, are people who are, you know, the strongest, the staunchest supporters of the farther ends of an extreme within the right or the left. So naturally, the incentive for any politician who wants to be on the national ballot, which they do, is to run more to the extremes, where both of these solutions, generally speaking, you would need to run to the middle, run to the largest population of Americans, the largest number of Americans, in order to have a chance to win, or increase your chances of
Yes.
winning.
And it's dividing us. And let me give you a specific example that might illustrate it for people. Let's take the controversial issue of gun control and what to do or not to do about it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Polls show that about 60% of all Americans think that, yes, we have a Second Amendment right, but it comes with responsibilities. If I'm going to have a gun, I've got to use it safely, learn to shoot it safely, keep it safely, handle it safely. And if I don't, and I use it in ways that endanger, using my right, I endanger others with this and take their rights away, I can be sanctioned in some fashion, and 60% of Americans are basically comfortable with that kind of an approach. And yet, you cannot get a single U.S. Republican senator to do anything substantive on that issue that isn't mostly very small and window dressing, incremental, this or that. And that all begins to make sense. So they have to get through, as you said, the Republican primary. But if I said to you, Brian, out of all the voter eligible people in America, what percentage are going to vote in the Republican primary?
I think it's what,
Shall I tell you the
15%?
answer, or would you like to guess? What?
I think it's 15% or something along those lines.
You're pretty close. It's the average is closer to 10, but it bounces around year to year, and so 10 to 15 is probably good. Now think about that. As you said just a few minutes ago, the Republican senator to get to the general election has to appeal to those 10 or 15%. And if he wins and gets to the election and is represented, he's now committed to pleasing that 10 or 15% when 60% of the people he or she represents think differently. And
Yeah.
he's not adhering to that. And on issue after issue, it divides us. So if you put all those candidates now on a single ballot, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and you let 100% of all the registered voters participate in picking, like Alaska or Nevada, the top 5 or the top 4. You can structure it in various ways to go on to the general election. And then in the general election, voters use something like ranked choice voting. You could use a runoff election too, but basically ranked choice voting is one option to pick which of those 4 or 5 candidates has the majority of people behind them. And if they don't have a majority for the first candidate, and they go through the process of ranking their candidates, and we can talk about how that works. It's pretty simple. If one doesn't get a majority on the first count, of the 5, let's say, candidates, the one with the least votes gets eliminated, but the people who voted for that candidate first lose that candidate, but they have a second choice, and it gets applied to that.
Yeah.
And so then you redo the balloting and you work it down till somebody has a majority that fits for half of so or more of the electorate.
Yeah.
And that ensures it brings us back to the middle. If you're that senator that appealed to the 10 or 15% on that gun rights issue in the primary, and you hold that same kind of a position in the general election, you're never going to get elected senator. It pulls us towards the middle. And that is going on to, that's a one issue election, I'm positing, just to make the example simple.
Sure.
But that plays in all our elections, and it's dividing us tremendously. It doesn't serve our public interest at all.
Well, it serves the interests of the entrenched powers of the Republican and Democratic parties. That's why they are in no hurry to implement these things or change this structure, because the structure is,
if we made it fairer, more equitable, more competitive, which would happen if they did their job and set up the political system to serve all voters, all of us, the interests of all of us. We'd be better off, but they'd have more competition, and it would be harder for them to get reelected and stay in office. It is not in their interest to fix the system. And I want to take a moment and not paint everybody in Congress or in state legislatures as opposing all this. There are loads of people in those positions that are in favor of this kind of change. But if they are not in a majority and therefore the legislation never passes, it's fair to say that Congress as a whole is not able to act on this and is serving its own interests. But
Sure.
I don't want to denigrate the people in the process that are trying hard to push this progress, because there are clearly many.
Absolutely. And and even the real reality of the situation is there's so many people who are good actors and get into politics for the right reasons. But when the system is set up in such a way that it basically incentivizes you to have to go against essentially your better angels, for lack of better words. And the reason you
That's
actually,
right.
went into this was to, like how we started off, like solve the problems for the American people. Um, yeah, it just makes it so difficult for those people to break through when the rules are basically stacked against um, them being able to do so.
One of the ways you could evaluate how well our political system is serving citizens, serving the interests of its citizens, is to evaluate our political system like you would some major enterprise, like you would an industry. And that's been done by a consulting expert out of Harvard who's one of the world renowned business consultants. He doesn't consult as much just for businesses, he consults for governments, a whole, whole sectors of the economy.
Yeah.
And, his name is Michael Porter, and a woman named Catherine Gell, who is also a businesswoman. She had a family company she, I think, inherited somehow. And she ran it well for a while and she sold it and had a pot full of money. And she feels strongly that we need to, because it isn't just Democrats or Republicans or independents, it's all over the lot where people come from that think we need to fix our democracy. And she's one of them. So she knew Michael Porter and she convinced Michael to use his gravitas and skill set with her to analyze the political system. And they first produced a report about 3 years ago, and then they made it into a book about 2 years ago. And I've been at presentations and read the book, and their conclusions are startling, but they reinforce exactly what you said.
Yeah.
They say our political system isn't broken, it's fixed. It delivers exactly the results the rules have been set to give them the best shot at delivering. And it goes on to say that it's a classic duopoly with huge barriers to competition. And the problem is that the politicians are serving their interests and not the public's interests, and et cetera. So
Yeah.
that's one of many ways you could examine how our political system is faring for its people.
Yeah, that book actually, coincidentally, The Politics Industry. I read that back in 2020, and that was what actually made me get involved in this whole. The Ford Party didn't exist at that point, but that book was the one that made me go looking for a way to, try to do something about this because it was such a clear thinking of it in business terms. I mean, that resonates very much with me in the way that I think about things. It was a great book for anybody who's not read it. Highly recommend.
As an example, from a business point of view, the way we handle healthcare in our country, where companies provide it and they pay for it, but they get a tax credit, and it's in their income and expense statement. When they go compete abroad with countries that have a separate healthcare system that is funded totally independent, you don't get it through your company. Those industries have that expense missing in their expenses. And so they can be more price competitive against their U.S. competitors because of that difference in how their healthcare is funded. And I was just talking with a friend the other day who said the main reason they're sticking with the particular employer they have is they need to have healthcare and they can't jeopardize the chance of ending up in a kind of job where you're freelancing and you don't have your own healthcare. It forces Americans to change the way we make our decisions, and that isn't optimal either.
Yeah, definitely isn't. So I want to switch gears here. You know, I'm definitely a big proponent of both ranked choice voting and open primaries, single ballot primaries for that matter. I mean, both of those intuitively make sense to me, and I think one thing that would intuitively make even more sense to pretty much any American you would ask, even if they don't follow politics, is there's too much big money in politics, too much corporate money, too much lobbying and special interests who are clearly have an outsized influence on decisions that are being made. The if we talk about the politics industry, they talk about, who are the consumers of, the companies. So the companies in that book being the Republicans and Democrats. I might be getting this a little wrong, but and the consumers, what they're after are votes. They're after money, and it's not it's not the everyday American that they're really focusing on right now. Their market, what they're focused on are these large donations, these large corporate interests, super PACs, and the like. So that seemed to have just gotten completely out of control and decayed our system to a point where, it's seemingly going to be very, very difficult, if not unfixable, in a lot of people's minds. But all that's to say is, what is your take on big money in politics, and how in the world can we go about trying to fight back against that issue?
Okay. Well, first of all, obviously what you just summarized is well documented. I think the New York Times at one point pointed out in some analysis they did that 40% of all the money that came in an election, this is back a cycle or two ago, came from, out of 330 million of us, it came from 25,000 big donors. 40%.
Amazing.
It's huge. And if you have 40 to 60% of everybody working today who's living paycheck to paycheck without savings, what can you expect them to give to a campaign? The system is set up wrong in terms of giving people an equal voice. It's giving huge additional clout to anybody with much more money.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to change that. And in order to change that, one of the more promising ways is a voucher system that basically would take the money it takes to run an election. And if you divide it by the number of voters in America, back a cycle or so ago when I did the math, so don't hold me exactly to this, it came out to about 40 or 50 bucks a person.
Mm-hmm.
When you divide it through by all of us, that number per person goes way down. It's a little more now because the costs are skyrocketing every election.
Sure.
But we're in that kind of range, 50 to 100 bucks maybe. So ask yourself, what would happen if you used our tax dollars that we paid to give each voter a voucher in some form? It could be a prepaid credit card that you couldn't use any other way. There are various ways you can do it, skipping the details. And the voters could then allocate that money in small amounts to those candidates that they thought had policies that spoke to their interests.
Sure.
If you did that, you're now empowering 100%, or at least conceptually 100% of all eligible voters to provide the money. If you then coupled that with a different way that we vet candidates on the presidential level, for example, to get into the presidential debates. You didn't say it's the percentage that 2% or more of the polls show in 10 polls, 2% or more have gotten sufficient support, say 3 or 4 out of those polls. That's the way the Democratic and Republican parties have, in a rough sense, set those kind of rules in the past. And instead you said, we don't want to pick the person with just the most money. It could come from a few sources, or they're independently wealthy. We want to pick the person who has policies that appeal to the most people.
Yeah.
So it's total number of small donations that you get that shows you have policies that are worth, in the smaller market you can reach people at. Now you earn the right to go to the next stage and let a broader swath of Americans hear about you in these debates. And that would change very dramatically how our politicians had to respond if they wanted to get into the debates and potentially get the money to run a successful campaign.
Hmm.
And so that's the most promising of the approaches that I'm aware of. You can substitute public financing, which is, if people get matching donation, or they get donations of a certain small amount, they'll get a match times 6 or whatever the number is of funds publicly to use. But then those donations that you matched are coming from a much smaller pool of people.
Yeah.
So I'm not as big a fan of that approach as I am of the vouchers. It's being tried in a few cities and around, but it's only beginning to catch on. But that would be very, very powerful.
I mean, I almost think that's more important than ranked choice voting and open primaries. I think that's the root cause of everything is, corporate interests, big money, controlling the decisions.
The difference is that ranked choice voting and open primaries now is beginning to get traction, and the other one is further behind.
Yeah.
But you're right. If you said what would change things the most, I think I'd put that one first too.
Yeah.
But as I said earlier, you got to put enough or all of the fixes together if you want to change the result.
Definitely. And I feel like, the people who benefit from the current rules are not going to really, if that did catch on, or even things like ranked choice voting and open primaries, I mean, there's a lot of pushback in a number of different states on, getting those things on the ballot to even vote on. And, the more this stuff catches on, the more that the powers that be are going to, push back. So it's like, I almost feel like the current strategy with the kind of electoral reform type approaches, that maybe is like a little more of a backdoor thing, and it's not as much of a direct affront to special interests, or the powers that be, if you will.
Now, this takes us in a slightly different direction, but I think that a good bit of this resistance is able to have a better shot at succeeding in blocking stuff because the American public doesn't hear enough about things we're talking about, how bad it is. And that goes to how the media cover our politics.
Mm.
And this goes right to the top. National Public Radio, the New York Times, all of them. To some extent, they do a wonderful job of covering the horse race on a particular issue. Here's what the Dems are doing. Here's what the Republicans are doing. What they don't do, let's take healthcare. They talk about Obamacare. They talk about the Republican objections to Obamacare. But suppose they said, look, the goal of the elected representative is to do what we talked about earlier, to provide, look at the systems and provide the system that provides good quality health care at the least system-wide cost in a sustainable manner. And if they examine what Congress is doing in relation to that issue when they're talking about health care, it would become quickly apparent to Americans how bad Congress is acting on their behalf. And let me give you one example. Right now, Congress has available to it 2 studies done separately that, if you put them together, show that we, according to the studies, can have Medicare for all, 330 million of us, at the highest of 5 alternative levels. The first study was done by the Congressional Budget Office, the research arm for Congress. The second study was done by 3 healthcare economists with long economic experience in healthcare costs. And basically, it would cost more than the present system in 2030, which is when it was set up. But at the highest level, the federal budget would go up by 4% in our national health care expenditures. But the states would have huge savings because the states pick up the cost for health care on 3 big pots. Mm-hmm. They provide health care for their employees, state employees, their insurance and all that. They provide it for, in Vermont, for example, the teachers, their salaries were low, so the state agreed they would provide their health care way back. As healthcare costs have gone up, they cut it back to, we provide 60% of the cost. But that's another pot. And Vermont's the second smallest state, and we've got 8,000 retirees and teachers and education, and the state is paying that salary. And so the third pot is the state share of Medicaid. So ratchet that out times 50 states, and the state savings are $800 billion by moving those costs over to the feds. And the feds cost only goes up by $295 billion. That's a $500 billion net savings. And it's really fair to examine the assumptions on everything. But if you have two studies sitting there that say we could provide health care to everybody in America, and they would save potentially, even if it saved nothing, but it could save potentially 500 billion a year in 2030 and on. Why isn't Congress all over this? Why isn't the Center for Medicare and Medicare Innovation all over this? And it isn't. So if the media talked about this in those terms, here's what they're doing on Obamacare, but here's what they're supposed to be doing is looking at this kind of issue. All of a sudden, the public would get a much better idea of how badly we're being treated. But they don't do that most of the time.
No, very rarely. I mean, it's, the issue I think with media, there's many issues, but topics like that, they can get real in the weeds very quickly. I love reading about stuff like this. I love talking about stuff like this. But as we were, mentioning several times, the everyday American doesn't have a lot of time or energy to invest in, this stuff, going down rabbit holes to figure out, read different studies on potential solutions, surrounding healthcare. It's like, it's an interesting challenge. And I think there's a lot of great creators on YouTube and other sources now who actually do a fantastic job of, presenting these things in like digestible ways that are interesting, right? With animations and different things. Cause that's the challenge, right? You want to present it in a way that's digestible and is interesting in this world where everyone has such short attention spans these days.
Yes. And it's a real challenge. I mean, I face that all the time.
Yeah.
The other side of the challenge is I have more than one friend who says, Rick, given the reasons you just said, keep it simple. Just what's the one thing you want to accomplish? Well, the one thing I really want to accomplish is to get proper representation. And it's a system problem, and there isn't one fix that will get that. And so how do you handle that? Because if I pick one issue and only talk about that, we're not going to fix the big problem. And that makes it very hard. I struggle with that.
Yeah, and that's something we talk about, within the Forward Party. Just a lot of people I talk to, we go back and forth on this. It's, how do we need to pick? Do we need an enemy? How do we simplify this in ways that can really galvanize people? Because people vote on emotion, especially people who, again, aren't going to be that plugged in to politics. How do we make this exciting, emotionally exciting for people? These things that we're talking about. Have you thought much about that?
I think about it a lot, but I don't have terribly good answers.
That's the hard part, right?
I know it's true that people make decisions more on the emotional level than on the rational level. I tend to be way too rational. My 31-year life partner, Sally, would second that. She had much bigger emotional range than I do.
That's funny.
A good combination, maybe.
Yeah, there you go. Balance each other out. Yeah, well, that's definitely a challenge we'll have to continue to work on, and let me know if you can find some things that work. And again, it's like everything else; it's kind of trial and error, right? It's a messaging trial and error. How can we present things in a way that's concise and cuts through the emotions, and what works? Let's do more of that. So. It's just like anything else. Let's just keep experimenting.
The one thing I have noticed out on my walk, I talk to a lot of different people. And they went all over the lot politically, from angry Hillary voters to angry Trump voters, or the equivalents in the modern elections.
Yeah.
And and if you start the conversation in terms of how well do you think those we elect are doing in representing our public interests, uh, you get almost virtual 100% agreement. Almost nobody thinks things are working right. And so if you can tap into that emotion somehow, in terms of the fix, uh, and the problem is that the fix has to be comprehensive, and it's very hard to talk about it. But on the other hand, we did it with the first 10 amendments, our Bill of Rights. Most of us can't recite the Bill of Rights 1 through 10. But on the other hand, we all know that this was something that was really going to help our individual freedoms, and it's an important part of our democracy. So maybe we need something I might call the democracy amendments.
Yeah.
And again, you know, to some extent, this bill in Congress that was just reintroduced, the Freedom to Vote Act, is trying to do that.
Okay.
It doesn't cover absolutely everything, but it covers a lot. It would be, if it were to pass, it would be the biggest improvement in a long time, and it would include, I think, because the prior version of it did include the trial among 3 states, probably a small one, a medium, and a large state, that that voucher system that I mentioned for
Really?
financing. Yes. And then it would also push public financing, which is the other system that I prefer the voucher to personally. Uh, so things like that. It would cover a whole bunch of things, but it wouldn't cover certain things like right now, one senator can block the appointments of all kinds of high-ranking people in our military. Uh, a minority of people in the Senate can block the will of the majority with the filibuster.
Mm-hmm.
Those are rule changes. The Senate could change them tomorrow if they just had enough votes to change the rules.
Yeah.
So those aren't in the kind of legislation that's now before Congress, but they're factors. The the electoral college system's another one that's separate, and so there are lots of pieces out there.
What do you so you're pretty well connected to just all the various movements, and you've been involved with this stuff, it sounds like, for quite some time. How long have you been involved with this kind of
I
fight?
guess it goes back to 1974. I
Okay.
was just finishing up law school in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown. I was headed out of town. I decided not to go to the city and chase the big bucks, but I wanted to go back to my home state of Vermont. And there aren't as many big bucks up here. So uh, on my way out of town, I stopped by Common Cause and said, "Hey, I'm going to Vermont. Is there anything I can do?" And they said, "Yeah, we don't have a state chapter. We do have at-large members nationally, and we do have one board member from Vermont. Can you go up there, get in touch with a board member, see if you can reach out to some of those members and start a chapter?" And so we all did. No one person does it alone. And that led to me being involved that way, which eventually led to me being on the National Common Cause Governing Board in the early 80s for half a dozen years. And so I guess you'd say it was about the end of the time for a lot of grad school
Yeah.
that I had enough bandwidth free to begin to refocus on larger issues besides, what's this course and what's the reading requirement and how do I get that material mastered?
Sure. Interesting. So Common Cause, just for those of us at home and who aren't familiar, what is Common Cause exactly?
Uh, well, it's a government that basically was formed by a guy named John Gardner. He was the Commissioner of Health, Education, and Welfare uh, under Nixon, actually. He was a Republican. But he believed he saw flaws in government and we needed to fix the process of the structure and financing of our political system. And so he started Common Cause to build membership to do that. And so it was pointing out this kind of stuff we've been talking about.
Hmm.
It promoted, it requested and gave testimony for Congress to change its ways and this and that and the other thing. And over the years, they've had small things that have gone their way, but in the big picture that I've watched, it's gotten worse rather than better.
Yeah.
But that was my beginning.
Fascinating. So I ask that. So you've got a good picture of the landscape, then definitely as to these various movements. There's all kinds of them these days, as far as third parties, organizations, nonprofits, groups like No Labels, who those are existing lawmakers. All kinds of them these days. What are you most excited about? One, as to what's going on right now, and the second question, I specifically mentioned No Labels. What is your take on them? No Labels.
Well, they've gotten right in the middle of a debate that comes on all the time. Ralph Nader is the guy who ran and he prevented Al Gore from getting elected. And in a two-party primary system where you have a minority and not a majority of Americans that can elect the next person, whether it's a president or somebody else, that becomes a big deal if that small percentage in a close race can push it. And so everybody jumps out, oh, we don't like the person who's doing that. What people ought to do, though, at the same time, under the present system, you can make that criticism.
Yeah.
But what we should be doing is changing the system so that you didn't have that problem. And we had a system that allowed a majority of people to weigh in and make the selection. So I would rather focus on the big picture, even though when you get down into the final months, we are within the system we have. At some point, though, if we don't change the system, the effects we're seeing come out of the judgments that are, or in more cases, aren't being made in Congress, and in some cases in our states by our reps. And we're going to continue going down the path further that we're on, and we're declining in lots of ways.
Yeah.
The economics are getting tougher for people in America. Loads of people don't have good health care. It's leading to a ton of social problems. It leads to people being more easily upset, and therefore they will appeal. Candidates can appeal to that emotion and head us off in diverging directions. It's all going on.
Yeah.
So focus on fixing the system, or at least in the energy I have, I guess, is my highest priority.
Definitely. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that really is the argument for ranked choice voting in a nutshell, right? This is a solution to the spoiler effect. There's people, many people, 40% of Americans now identify as independents, who would be very interested in seeing someone other than, if we're talking the presidential election, definitely, the last recent years, but for many years, frankly, in seeing another option, right? And many people don't vote for that other option because they're worried about being a spoiler, and they vote for the lesser of two evils instead.
Right. Let me make one other point. I have increasingly become resistant to the labels that the media, politicians, use to talk about left, right, progressive, conservative, and on and on. And let me give you an example. We talked about the healthcare example and the $500 billion savings that could come potentially, if the analysis held, to provide healthcare for everybody.
Yeah.
So if you have representatives in Congress that are pushing for that, now we don't have enough of them right now, but if you do, and they're pushing for that, and they're making those kind of arguments, you can try and shoot them down, but unless you got better evidence, those are good arguments for why we should be moving in that direction. So if someone is doing that, are they conservative or progressive or liberal? Or are they just a congressperson doing their job as they're supposed to do it under the Constitution?
Hmm. Yeah, that's
And if
interesting.
we'd spent more time talking about it in those terms, that would help to break through this, obfuscation that's going on. When the media talk about the horse race, they are basically routinizing the way we think about our politics because we're not thinking about it in terms of what are they really supposed to be doing. So if we could change that, which is very difficult, but I think it's important to try,
Yeah.
it would make a difference.
Well, I think
So that's something that rattles around in my head.
Oh, that's super interesting, and I think media has such an important role. Even independent, creators like me and you, and any number of other people out there doing things like this. But I'm not independent. I have a team of Texas Forward podcast team. Shout out to them, Emily and Julie. Didn't want to take the credit here, but that's neither here nor there. That kind of ties it together in a way I've never thought about, because I listen to people like from a Democrat or a Republican speak on somebody's podcast, or I listen to them just approaching a problem. And, there's people I'm just like, I like them. They think about things rationally. They're trying to solve the problems. But that's such a great way of simplifying that. I didn't have a way to put that into words like you're doing. Is this someone who's doing their job, doing the job that they were sent to Congress to do, right? And that could
Pretty
be,
hard to find them,
yeah,
but they're there.
they are there. They are there,
They're there.
and at least there's, even if they don't always vote that way, there's plenty of them who communicate that way, especially in things like podcasts, where you can hear just the way that they think, and they're not giving these canned answers, and they maybe, are changing their mind on something when they have new information, and are willing to just kind of hear out both sides to an argument, right? And figure out which is the best way forward. Yeah,
Agreed.
interesting. Well, Rick, I think no better way to wrap it up. That's what you shoot for with these podcasts, is wrap up where you started. So that masterfully done on your end, bringing it full circle.
I'm not sure. I'm a grand strategist. It just ended up the way it ended up. Hey, you're raising important stuff, and we have to find more ways to amplify these kind of conversations. Let people hear, and they can listen to other stuff, and then think about who's got the weight of the evidence, who's blowing the most smoke, what way does it make most sense for us to move forward in our country? Because the stakes are high.
Yeah.
And it's not looking well in the future if we don't change things.
Yeah, it's about long-term, not short-term thinking, right? We need to think system, not, today's election. Well, Rick,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This has been a pleasure, and I will absolutely be following your walking to fix democracy, your adventure here coming up. And when are you hitting the road again?
I'm going to begin driving west in the tow car in 2 or 3 days. So this is imminent.
All right.
Everything's changed. The schedule was all screwed up. I had to redo the schedule. I'm too far north in the winter this year. I'm going to have to break for 3 months or so, and beginning of snow flying, and I'll restart again in mid-April when I'll be out on the plains heading across the plain states and into Madison, Wisconsin, and then on from there. But that'll be next year.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, you might see me in the RV turn up. I'll have to drain the RV because it'll freeze up in the winter. It won't be very livable, but I can use it as messaging. You might see me turn up at some of the primary debates and things to raise some questions of any candidate I can bird dog.
Well, I hope we do, Rick. I hope we do. And for anybody who wants to support you and what you're doing, the website, one more time, is fixourdemocracy.org. Is that right?
Yes.
Fixourdemocracy.org. And is that the best way to find out more about what you're doing?
Yes, it is. And hey, if you want to take a break for a couple of days in Texas and come on out and drive the RV and do a little organizing, feel free. You can use it as a platform for stuff relating to the Forward Party, because any of us, regardless of the labels, that are working on substantive fixes are doing something important.
100%. And honestly, that sounds like an absolute blast. I would love to take you up on that at some point in time. I'll tell you this: you don't want me driving the RV though. That would be not good.
I can use a good organizer.
Okay, well maybe that
Communicate.
more of a chance to be decent at that. But Rick, thanks again. Thank you to all our listeners for tuning in as always. Really appreciate the people who support this podcast and what the Forward Party does. If there's anything you want to hear more about that you liked, didn't like, or have an opinion on about this conversation or anyone else you'd like to see on the show, let us know. Thanks again, everybody. Thanks again, Rick. We'll see everybody
Thanks. My pleasure.
next time. Take care.
Good night, Brian.